The Vikings conquered half of Europe, terrorized kingdoms for 300 years, and built absolutely nothing to defend themselves. Meanwhile, every civilization they crushed was hiding behind massive stone walls. Were they arrogant, stupid, or did they understand something about warfare that we've completely forgotten? The average Viking longship took 40,000 hours of skilled labor to build. 40,000. That's 20 craftsmen working full-time for an entire year on a single vessel. And Vikings didn't build just one. A powerful chieftain might command 10, 15, even 20 of these things. We're talking about the economic output of small kingdoms floating on water. Meanwhile, their English and French counterparts were stacking stones into castles, convinced that's what powerful people did. Vikings looked at that and laughed. See, here's what most people miss about Viking culture. They didn't measure wealth the way everyone else did. Forget land, forget fortresses, forget how many peasants farmed your fields. You want to know how rich a Viking jarl was? Count his ships. A fleet of 10 longships could raid 30 coastal monasteries in a single season. 30. The silver and gold from those raids would make most European lords weep into their expensive tapestries. And the beautiful part? You can't do that from behind castle walls. Building a castle meant staying put. It meant watching opportunities sail past while you sat there maintaining your expensive pile of rocks. Vikings understood something fundamental about wealth that castle builders never grasped. Money moves. Now, I've always found it funny how historians describe Vikings as primitive compared to their castle-dwelling neighbors. Really? The people who developed the most advanced shipbuilding technology in medieval Europe were primitive? That's like calling a Formula One team unsophisticated because they don't own a parking garage. But there's a catch to this ship-obsessed economy. Longships only lasted 20 to 30 years before they fell apart. Salt water, constant use, battle damage, these things weren't permanent investments. So Vikings kept building. They poured resources into vessels that would eventually rot, rather than structures that might last centuries. Makes sense, right? Actually, it makes perfect sense when you understand their logic. Owning a great haul was respectable. Owning a great ship made you dangerous. Vikings preferred dangerous, but ships weren't their only clever solution. Their homes told an even stranger story. Now here's where Viking life gets interesting. A typical longhouse wasn't meant to last forever. It was meant to last long enough. These wooden structures could be stripped of valuables and abandoned in under a day. Everything important went onto carts or ships. And the family? Gone before sunset. Try doing that with a castle. The beauty of wooden construction is this. Find a forest, grab some neighbors, and you've got a new home in 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if you're picky about the roof. My grandfather used to say the best house is one you can leave without crying. Vikings apparently agreed. But here's the thing people miss. These longhouses ranged from 15 to 75 feet long. Extended families lived together under one roof. Grandparents, parents, kids, weird Uncle Bjorn who talks to seagulls, everyone. And everyone had to agree when it was time to go. Stone castles? Those were multi-generational projects. Your great-grandfather started it. Your grandson might finish it. A longhouse needed one decent summer and some cooperative neighbors with axes. Here's where it gets really clever. If enemies approached, Vikings didn't defend their homes like scared rabbits. They burned them, deliberately, set fire to everything, denied the enemy any resources, then sailed away laughing. Probably drinking, too. Sounds crazy, right? But think about it. Why let invaders sleep in your bed and eat your stored grain? Burn it all. Build another one somewhere else. Problem solved. This design philosophy spread across 2,000 miles of coastline. From Norway to Iceland to Greenland, the same basic structure repeated everywhere. Why? Because it worked. A longhouse never became a prison, never became a target worth dying for, never became something you'd sacrifice your family to protect. And that's the genius. Vikings built homes they could love and leave, not homes that would get them killed, but mobility only matters if the economics make sense. And Viking economics were absolutely brutal. What they calculated about raiding versus defending will completely change how you see medieval warfare. Here's the thing about castles that nobody talks about. They're defensive. And Vikings, they didn't do defense. Why would they? The monastery you raid today isn't sailing across the North Sea to burn your farm tomorrow. Monks don't do revenge raids. They pray, maybe write angry letters in Latin. That's about it. Lindisfarne in 793 AD changed everything Europeans thought they knew about warfare. One raid, a few hours of work. Vikings walked away with gold, silver, and slaves worth more than most English lords earned in 10 years. 10 years. For one morning's effort. Now here's where the math gets brutal. A castle garrison needs feeding. Every single day. Winter, summer, doesn't matter. 50 warriors sitting behind walls eat through grain stores like teenagers at an all-you-can-eat buffet. And what do they produce? Nothing. They just wait. But 50 raiders? They only eat during expeditions. When the raid's done, everyone goes home to their farms, catches fish, grows barley, becomes economically productive again. I've always found this fascinating. Vikings essentially invented seasonal employment centuries before anyone else figured it out. Work hard for 3 months raiding, spend 9 months farming, repeat. And the strategic problem with castles gets worse. Defending one fortress ties up 50 men permanently. Those same 50 raiders, they can hit 5 different targets in a single season. Maybe more if the weather cooperates. Every stone laid in a castle wall represented ores that weren't being carved. Every hour spent mixing mortar was an hour not spent training rowers. Vikings understood opportunity cost before economists invented the term. Makes sense, right? When your enemies pour their wealth into walls, you're already counting their silver. That was the Viking advantage. While Anglo-Saxon kings bankrupted themselves building fortifications, Vikings just sailed around them, found the gaps, hit the soft targets. But this raiding economy created a problem, a big one. Because Vikings didn't just reject castles for military reasons, their entire social structure made permanent power bases almost impossible to maintain. And that's where things get really interesting. Here's the thing about Viking chieftains. They couldn't just sit in a castle and expect people to obey them. That's not how it worked. A Viking jarl ruled through one thing: generosity. You kept followers by giving them stuff. Gold rings, weapons, land, a share of raid profits. The moment you stopped giving, they walked, literally just packed up and found a better boss. Now picture trying to build a castle in that system. You're telling your warriors, hey, instead of raiding monasteries and getting rich, let's spend 3 years stacking rocks. Good luck keeping anyone around. And free Vikings had every legal right to leave. This wasn't medieval Europe where peasants were tied to the land. A Viking farmer who didn't like his chieftain could sail to Iceland, settle in Ireland, or just move 2 fjords over. Try building a castle when your workforce can legally quit anytime they want. The Thing assembly system made this even more complicated. Major decisions happened in open fields where free men gathered to vote and argue. Not behind walls, not in throne rooms. Democracy is messy, but it's really hard to do from inside a fortress. Here's what surprised me when I first learned this. About 20% of Viking-age Scandinavians were thralls, slaves. You'd think wealthy Vikings would build massive estates to show off their status. But nope, rich jarls lived in wooden longhouses that looked remarkably similar to what free farmers lived in. Bigger, sure. Fancier carvings, definitely. But the same basic structure. Why? Because flaunting permanent wealth made you look scared, made you look like you were protecting something instead of going out and taking more. A jarl who built a castle sent one message: he was afraid. A jarl who built ships sent a completely different message: he was about to make everyone around him wealthy. Guess which one attracted more followers? But social structure was only part of the equation. Because even if Vikings wanted castles, Scandinavian geography had other plans. And those plans made castles look genuinely stupid. Norway's coastline stretches over 15,000 miles when you count all the fjords. 15,000. That's like driving from New York to Los Angeles 5 times. Now imagine building castles to defend that. You can't. Nobody could, and Vikings knew it. Here's what made Scandinavian geography so brutal for defensive warfare. The entire coastline is basically Swiss cheese. Fjords cutting inland everywhere. Hidden coves, tiny islands, 1,000 places to land a ship without anyone seeing you. So, what's the point of a castle? Let's say you build one. A big stone fortress right on the coast. Looks impressive, cost a fortune. Your enemy just sails past it to the next fjord over and lands there instead. Your expensive castle is now protecting absolutely nothing. My father used to say, trying to guard everything means guarding nothing. Vikings understood this instinctively. But wait, it gets worse. Scandinavian winters are brutal. We're talking months of frozen ground, limited food, and temperatures that'll kill you if you're not careful. A castle garrison needs feeding every single day. Where's that food coming from when everything's buried under snow? Meanwhile, raiders don't have this problem. They attack in summer, grab what they want, then go home to their farms. They fish, they hunt, they survive winter doing normal things while your castle garrison slowly starves behind frozen walls. The geography created another advantage too. Vikings positioned their settlements at fjord mouths specifically. Why? Because from there you can escape in any direction. Enemy ships coming from the north, sail south, army approaching by land. Take to the water. Try doing that from a castle. Mountains and dense forests already provided natural barriers, free fortifications that cost nothing to maintain. Building stone walls in Scandinavia would be like installing a fancy lock on your front door while leaving every window wide open, which sounds stupid when you say it out loud. But here's something interesting. Vikings did occasionally build fortifications, specific ones, for specific purposes, and the way they built them reveals exactly what they actually valued. But here's the thing. Vikings weren't stupid about defense. When they absolutely needed walls, they built them. Just not in stone, and definitely not forever. The Trelleborgs are proof. These were ring fortresses that looked like someone dropped a geometry textbook on Denmark. The one at Slagelse housed 500 warriors in 16 identical longhouses, all arranged with mathematical precision that would make your high school math teacher weep with joy. Here's what made them different from European castles, though. They went up in months, not decades, not generations. Months. A Danish king needed to muster an army for a specific campaign. Build a Trelleborg. Campaign's over. Walk away. Let the wood rot. Who cares? The Trelleborg served its purpose like a rental car. You use it, you return it, you don't cry about it. Trading towns like Hedeby got wooden palisades too. At its peak, Hedeby had around 1,500 residents buying and selling goods from across the known world. That's worth protecting. So they threw up walls, positioned guards, and kept the commerce flowing. But notice what's missing. No noble family claimed these fortresses as ancestral seats. No dynasty planted their flag and said, "This belongs to us forever." The walls protected business, not bloodlines. Temporary solutions for temporary problems. I actually find this weirdly practical. My grandfather used to say, "Don't build a brick house if you might need to move the lot." Vikings basically turned that into military doctrine, and when Danish kings finally started building proper stone castles after 1050 AD, that's when historians say the Viking Age ended. Not because of some dramatic battle, not because of a plague or conquest, because they started acting like Europeans. Stone walls meant staying. Staying meant inheritance laws. Inheritance laws meant feudalism, and feudalism meant the end of everything that made Vikings terrifying in the first place. Which raises an interesting question. If Vikings rejected castles on land, what exactly were they doing at sea? Turns out they brought their castle with them. Here's the thing most people miss. Vikings didn't avoid castles because they couldn't build them. They avoided castles because they already had something better, the longship. Sounds crazy, right? Comparing a boat to a stone fortress? But hear me out. A longship's raised prow and stern created defensive positions during sea battles. Basically tower-like platforms where archers could rain arrows down on attackers. 30 feet up, enemies below. That's a tactical advantage any castle builder would recognize. And those shields you see in every Viking movie mounted along the railings, not just decoration. That's a mobile wooden wall traveling wherever the warriors went. A fortification that moved at 8 knots. Now here's where it gets interesting. Viking crews lived aboard these ships for weeks at a time. Sleeping, eating, storing weapons, and plunder. The longship wasn't just transportation, it was home base. A floating headquarters that happened to have an escape function built right in. The numbers actually line up perfectly. An average longship carried 30 to 60 warriors. Guess how many soldiers garrisoned a small Norman castle? About the same. Same defensive capability. One moves, one doesn't. I think about this whenever I visit old castles. All that stone, all that labor, and Vikings achieved the same result with oak planks and good craftsmanship. But the real genius? Retreat speed. If a castle garrison faces a superior force, they're stuck. Siege time, hope the food holds out. A Viking ship crew facing trouble, They're gone before the enemy finishes breakfast. You cannot besiege something that sails away. Even beached, a longship transformed into an instant fort. Shields raised, warriors positioned behind the railings, natural defensive structure. And when the threat passed, the fort simply floated off to the next fjord. No permanent commitment, no peasants maintaining walls, no years of construction. Just wood, water, and the option to leave whenever strategic conditions changed. The ship was the castle. The castle was the ship. But here's where things get really strange. When Vikings actually conquered foreign territory, they could have built anything they wanted. So what did they choose? Here's the thing that drives historians crazy. Vikings absolutely knew how to build castles. They just didn't want to, and we can prove it. Look at Normandy. When Vikings settled there in 911 AD, they started building castles almost immediately. Stone walls, towers, moats, the whole medieval package. Within 100 years, Norman castles were the most advanced fortifications in Europe. Same Vikings, same engineering knowledge, completely different choice. Now compare that to England. Danish Vikings controlled huge chunks of England for 200 years. The Danelaw, they called it. Prime real estate, wealthy towns, strategic rivers, perfect castle territory. Number of stone castles they built, 0, not 1. Then William the Conqueror shows up in 1066. His Normans, who were descended from Vikings, by the way, constructed over 500 castles within 20 years. That's not a technology gap. That's a philosophy gap. Take Dublin. Vikings founded it around 841 AD. Ran it for 2 centuries straight. Major trading hub, serious wealth flowing through. And the whole time, it stayed a wooden town. Wooden walls, wooden buildings, wooden everything. Why would you do that? Because wood meant options. Stone meant commitment. And committed Vikings were, in their minds, trapped Vikings. Or consider York. The Vikings renamed it Jorvik, and it became the second largest city in England. 10,000 people at its peak. Thriving economy, political center of the entire Danelaw. Still no castle. I visited York, and you can literally see where Norman castles went up decades later. The Vikings had the same hilltops, the same defensive positions. They just walked past them and built longhouses instead. This pattern repeats everywhere Vikings settled temporarily. Wooden structures, easy to abandon, nothing that would chain them to a losing position. But something changed when Vikings stopped raiding and started ruling, when keeping land became more important than taking it, and that change had a name. Actually, it had a symbol, a cross. Christianity didn't just reshape Viking religion, it fundamentally altered their entire relationship with permanent structures. 865 AD. A Viking army lands in England, about 3,000 warriors. No supply wagons, no siege equipment, no plan to build anything permanent. What they did have was terrifying: speed. This force became known as the Great Heathen Army, and for 14 years they ran circles around every English kingdom. 4 of them fell. 4 entire kingdoms. And here's the thing that should embarrass every castle builder in history. The English had walls. They had fortifications. They had stone towers designed specifically to stop invasions. Didn't matter. The Vikings simply went around them. They used rivers like highways, paddling past every fixed defense the English had spent decades constructing. You can't fight what you can't catch. And you definitely can't catch warriors who travel faster than your messengers. Let me tell you my favorite example. The Vikings captured York, one of the most fortified cities in England, by attacking during a Christian festival. The defenders were literally at church, not manning the walls, just praying. The Vikings weren't being disrespectful, they were being smart. Why fight walls when you can fight empty walls? But here's where it gets interesting. King Alfred the Great finally figured out how to stop them. His solution? He built a network of fortified towns called burhs throughout his kingdom. Basically, he copied the defensive strategy that Vikings themselves refused to use. He became the castle builder, and it actually worked. Makes sense, right? If your enemy won't sit still, you create obstacles everywhere they might go. The Great Army covered over 2,000 miles across England during their campaign. 2,000 miles. That's like walking from London to Moscow. And they did it while English kings sat behind their expensive stone walls, wondering why their strategy wasn't working. The walls meant nothing because Vikings controlled the rivers connecting them. They turned England's geography into their own transportation network, but conquering territory creates a problem. Eventually, you have to keep it. And that's when everything about Viking warfare had to change. Here's the thing nobody tells you about history. Cultures don't die in battle. They die when they stop believing their own ideas work. Christianity hit Scandinavia hard after the year 1000. And churches? Churches needed protection. You can't exactly sail away with a cathedral when enemies show up. For the first time, Vikings had permanent things worth defending. Then came the real transformation. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden stopped being collections of independent chieftains and became actual kingdoms, unified territories, borders on maps. Suddenly, land mattered more than mobility. Harald Hardrada learned this lesson the worst way possible. In 1066, this legendary warrior, a man who'd fought from Constantinople to England, died at Stamford Bridge. Why? Because he stood and fought a fixed battle instead of raiding and retreating. The last great Viking died fighting like a European. The math had changed completely. When you're raiding, ships beat walls every single time. But when you're trading, when you've got permanent markets and harbors generating steady income, those harbors need stone walls around them. The economics flipped. Within 100 years of mass Christianization, Scandinavian kings were building castles you couldn't tell apart from French or German ones. Same stone, same towers, same feudal logic. My grandfather used to say people only change when staying the same costs more than changing does. Vikings proved him right. They weren't stupid. They weren't incapable of building fortifications. They simply calculated, correctly, that mobility served them better than walls, until it didn't. The moment raiding stopped paying better than trading, the moment kingdoms replaced chieftains, the moment churches needed guarding, that's when castle walls went up across Scandinavia. And here's what that really means. Being a Viking was never about genetics or geography. It was a strategy, a calculation, a choice to stay mobile in a world of static targets. When Vikings stopped refusing castles, they stopped being Vikings. The ships rotted. The raids ended. The longhouses became permanent. The identity and the strategy, they were always the same thing.